Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the absolutely wild, chaotic story of how a tiny, scrappy city of outcasts transformed into the greatest empire in human history. We're going to trace the entire evolution of Rome, from a small kingdom to an unstoppable global powerhouse. And then we're going to unpack the massive structural factors that eventually led to its spectacular collapse in the West. It is a story packed with shifting borders, brilliant leaders, and completely disastrous betrayals. Let's get into it. All right, we've got to start with the absolute legend of the twin babies, Romulus and Remus. According to the myth, these two were the rightful heirs to an ancient Latin kingdom, and they were supposedly rescued and raised by a female wolf after their evil uncle tried to, permanently delete them in a river. Now, archaeologists and historians will totally burst your bubble and tell you that a wolf nursing two future kings is strictly a foundation myth. But here's the thing, the Romans believed it deeply. And honestly, this origin story of surviving against impossible odds and violently fighting for power, it perfectly set the tone for the civilization they were about to build. It is honestly wild to think that the actual founding of the Roman Empire basically kicked off with a petty sibling argument. The twins grow up into these tall, muscular troublemakers, and they want to build their own city. But they literally cannot agree on which hill to put it on. So how do they settle it? They ask the gods by counting birds. Remus sees 6 birds over on Aventine Hill, but Romulus claims he sees 12 on Palatine Hill. Remus accuses his brother of cheating, things escalate, and it ends with Romulus building a tiny wall, Remus mockingly jumping over it, and Romulus literally eliminating his brother on the spot. So, Romulus wins. He's the king. But his shiny new city is essentially just a homeless camp with really big ambitions. To actually populate this place, Romulus declares Rome an asylum city. This wasn't a gated community for the elite, okay? It was a wide open door for runaway slaves, debt dodgers, exiles, and criminals. He attracts this incredibly chaotic, all-male crowd of ancient troublemakers. A completely wild start for sure, but it gave Rome the sheer manpower it desperately needed to survive. Well, that all-male setup led to a massive, totally obvious demographic problem. They had exactly 0 women. Their solution to this? An 8th century BC kidnapping event. They invite their neighbors, the Sabines, over for a massive housewarming party. Right in the middle of the party, the Romans just kidnap the Sabine women. Naturally, the Sabine men are furious and come back with an army for revenge. But then, plot twist, the Sabine women themselves walk right between the two armies, stop the fighting, and demand that the two kingdoms just merge together. And boom, just like that, a peace treaty was born. Fast forward a couple of centuries. Rome cycles through 7 different kings, but that 7th one is so incredibly toxic and cruel that the people actually rally together and boot him out of the city. At that point, Rome decides to swear off kings forever. To keep power balanced, they invent the Republic. Instead of one supreme ruler, they elect 2 consuls who rule at the exact same time, only serve for a single year, and have the power to literally veto each other. They honestly thought they had perfectly solved the problem of tyranny. Now, this extreme distaste for kings ultimately kind of builds into Rome's villain arc. They become incredibly militaristic, expanding outward constantly until they run smack into their biggest rival across the sea, Carthage. This sparks the Punic Wars, which are basically 3 blockbuster sequels of absolute chaos. In the first war, Rome doesn't even have a navy, so they just steal Carthaginian ship designs and win. In the second war, the legendary Hannibal marches literal elephants over the Alps and wrecks Rome for years. But somehow, Rome still manages to pull off a win. And in the third war, Rome simply deletes the entire city of Carthage from the timeline to make sure they'd never ever be a threat again. With their only real rival out of the picture, Rome gets completely addicted to expansion. They are conquering tribes and civilizations everywhere. Spain, North Africa, Greece, Gaul. They eventually absorb roughly 10% of all humanity into their territory. I mean, they were building an unstoppable powerhouse, but growing that big, that fast, it was putting an incredible, unsustainable strain on their political system back home. Section 1. Julius Caesar, the final boss of the Republic. So, when Julius Caesar eventually marches his army into Rome, starts collecting political titles like their trading cards, and takes total control, the Senate is absolutely terrified. They see a tyrant destroying their 500-year-old republic. But the regular Roman people, they actually loved him, and it's easy to see why. He fixes the calendar to 365 days, lowers taxes, cancels debts, gives out free grain so the poor won't starve, and hands over land to war veterans. He wasn't just conquering, he was literally giving their everyday lives a massive upgrade. But the Senate just couldn't handle his absolute power, so they brutally murder Caesar right in the middle of a Senate meeting, genuinely patting themselves on the back thinking, hey, we saved the Republic. Yeah, that hilariously and tragically backfired. Because the people loved Caesar so much, his assassination didn't restore peace at all. It plunged Rome straight into another massive, bloody civil war.
Which brings us to Section 2. Augustus fixes the empire.
Out of the ashes of that civil war rises Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who eventually earns the title Augustus. He officially becomes Rome's first emperor in 27 BC. Now, Augustus actually knew how to fix the structural issues that broke the Republic. He brilliantly solves the civil war problem with one massive reform. He realizes that the Republic fell because soldiers were fighting for individual, rich generals who promised them loot rather than fighting for Rome itself. So, Augustus turns the military into a professional standing army. Soldiers now enlist for 20 years, they get paid directly by the state, and the government guarantees their retirement land. By making soldiers permanently loyal to the Roman state, he instantly cuts off the main fuel source for civil wars. He also completely shifts Rome's military policy. Instead of endless, chaotic conquering, Augustus looks around and realizes, okay, we are big enough. He shifts the entire focus to securing their massive borders, like the Rhine and the Danube rivers. He orders the construction of permanent forts and road networks. This major pivot from offense to defense essentially locks down what we now call Rome's Golden Age, giving the empire the long-term stability it really needed to thrive. Moving into Section 3, shifting borders and betrayals. Now, holding those newly defined borders was anything but easy. The frontiers were highly volatile, and maintaining control meant you had to rely heavily on local allies. And sometimes, trusting the wrong people in the deep, dark woods can change the course of history forever. This brings us to 9 AD, and a completely catastrophic military blunder. You have the Roman general Varus, super overconfident, convinced the Germanic region is totally pacified. On the other side is Arminius, a local leader who actually grew up with the Romans, served in their army, and knows their tactics inside and out. Arminius totally plays Varus, tricking him into marching 3 entire legions right into the muddy, terrifying Teutoburg Forest, a place where traditional Roman military formations were completely useless. And guys, this wasn't a battle, it was an absolute slaughter. Germanic fighters ambushed the stretched-out Roman line, and over the course of just a few days, 20,000 highly trained professional Roman soldiers were completely wiped out. This shocking ambush permanently changed Rome's policy. The psychological trauma back in Rome was so deep that Augustus completely abandoned the idea of pushing any further into Germania. The Rhine River became the hard, permanent frontier, fully committing Rome to a defensive posture for centuries. Section 4. The Praetorian Guard and the Long Decline. Fast forward a bit past Augustus's golden age, and the cracks really start to show. The emperors slowly lose their grip, and power shifts away from the Senate, moving straight into the hands of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own heavily armed elite bodyguards. Rome becomes a chaotic mess. The Praetorian Guard literally starts killing emperors they don't like and installing their own guys. Out on the borders, legions realize that if they control the biggest army, their general could just march on Rome and be emperor. Add in devastating 3rd century plagues and massive hyperinflation, and the empire is forced to literally chop itself into pieces, splitting administration into the east and the west just to survive the sheer complexity of ruling it all. Finally, Section 5, the collapse of the West. While the eastern half of the empire eventually evolves into the Byzantine Empire and survives for another 1,000 years, the West faces a brutal historical domino effect that completely breaks it apart. And it all traces back to mismanaged border policies. The fearsome Huns push the Goths out of their lands, right? So tens of thousands of Goths show up at the Roman border, literally begging for asylum. Rome actually lets them in, but then incredibly corrupt Roman officials totally exploit and starve them. The mistreated Goths, completely understandably, revolt. And it's a massive revolt. They destroy a Roman army and actually kill the emperor on the battlefield. Rome realizes way too late that by mismanaging asylum seekers, they had basically just imported a civil war. Absolute panic sets in. The West starts making these desperate land deals with armed groups they can no longer defeat, essentially outsourcing their own defense. But the fatal blow? That comes when the Vandals rampage through and capture North Africa. This was catastrophic. North Africa was the economic engine of the West. By losing it, Rome lost their main grain supply and crucial tax revenues, which meant they could no longer pay their soldiers. The military completely starved from the inside out. Which leads us to the year 476 AD. There is no epic final movie battle. The Western Roman Empire is just utterly exhausted. In a wildly ironic twist of fate, the very last emperor is a boy named Romulus Augustulus, literally named after both Rome's mythical founder and its first great emperor. His dramatic military commander simply steps up and politely asks him to stop being emperor. He quietly surrenders, and just like that, the Western Roman Empire officially blinks out of existence.
So we just watched a tiny, chaotic village of outcasts grow into an unstoppable global force, only to completely crumble under the weight of its own mismanaged borders, political corruption, and outsourced military power. What can the epic rise and fall of Rome's mighty storybook teach us about the complex systems, borders, and institutions in our own modern world? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for checking out this explainer.